So the last year and a half for Final Fantasy has actually been pretty eventful. So back in June of last year, Final Fantasy 16 was released, and then 8 months ago in February of this year, Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth was released. That is part 2 of the planned trilogy of the 7th Final Fantasy game. So definitely a lot for Square Enix to kind of process with, obviously, their flagship series, or at least some would call it that. You know, how is Final Fantasy doing these days, especially now that they have had these 2 new installments kind of back to back? Well, there was actually a financial results briefing that was held 4 months ago back in May for Square Enix, and as these things go, sometimes they happen and then they are not made available to the public until later. Now, in some cases, I think for some companies, they kind of get leaked to the public, but it looks like in this case, Square Enix actually has a section on their website where they actually make these sort of presentations and briefings available to the public. So it was noticed that this financial briefing from 4 months ago was actually just now made public. So people have dug through it, and it turns out that Square Enix is actually not happy with Final Fantasy, specifically how they've been doing with sales, and I guess more specifically with profits. So Takashi Kiryu stated, quote, "We released several new titles," he's talking about recently, "and this includes major releases like Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, but unfortunately profits did not meet our expectations." That is what he said. And then also when talking specifically about initial sales, he also brought up again Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth by stating that these initial sales were, quote, "not as strong as expected." Now, some things to unpack here. First and foremost, something I noticed a lot of people bringing up is that I guess Square Enix actually has very high, some would say unrealistic expectations when it comes to the sales performance of their games. I guess they are notorious for this. So yeah, I don't know, maybe them being disappointed or, saying the profits didn't meet our expectations. I don't know, maybe that's kind of just tough love. That's kind of the norm for them. Maybe they're used to saying that because their expectations are always just kind of out of reach. I don't know, but I mean, they still did say, it didn't meet our expectations. It still definitely signals that they are not overall happy with the sales and profits performance of the Final Fantasy IP as of late. Now, another thing to bring up too, this was, like I said, 4 months ago. I mean, yeah, 4 months ago kind of just seems like yesterday, but for something like Final Fantasy, a lot can change in 4 months, so maybe this doesn't reflect their actual current status quo. As others have pointed out, since May, Final Fantasy has had the new Dawn Trail expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, that's their online MMO, and who knows, maybe sales kind of got a little bit better in the past 4 months for Final Fantasy, who knows. Now, the main thing that I saw people pointing out that I thought was very interesting is that people noticed that it was actually back in May, pretty much around the time that they would have had this financial results briefing. Yeah, it was around this time actually that Square Enix announced, if you remember, that they wanted to have a quote-unquote aggressive multi-platform strategy. Basically, it would seem that they were not satisfied with their sales, especially, just having a track record of kind of just going with Sony. They probably have a lot of Sony exclusivity deals. So yeah, with the sales of Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth and Final Fantasy 16 being lackluster in the eyes of Square Enix back in May, this might have actually been exactly what triggered that comment by Square Enix. That they wanted to pursue kind of a different option. They wanted to have an aggressive strategy to put their games on, I would assume, as many platforms as they can. And it is also worth mentioning that just 2 days ago, actually, Final Fantasy 16 was released actually on PC. Yeah, it has been a PS5 exclusive for over a year now, but now kind of a part of maybe this multi-platform strategy, they decided to, maybe break out of their seemingly outdated one console strategy. It is also heavily rumored that Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth will be getting a PC release and maybe even like an Xbox release very soon. This happened with the predecessor, the Final Fantasy 7 Remake. That happened like a year or two after its release, so yeah, it's probably coming. But yeah, to me, I mean, on one hand, it definitely sucks to hear that Square Enix, isn't pleased about Final Fantasy, their performance, how they've been doing. If you are a Final Fantasy fan, it's of course not good to hear that. But at the same time, if you're probably any gamer who really just wants games to be as multi-platform as possible, this could be a very good thing. Square Enix is obviously seeing the downside to having the, like I said, one console strategy, and I really think this is exactly what triggered their comments, their, aggressive multi-platform comments back in May. I think this was probably a direct result of this financial results briefing. So with the apparently poor performance of the two recent Final Fantasy games, maybe this will be the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Maybe Final Fantasy as we know it will now be done with any kind of future PlayStation exclusive deals.